Welcome to Classics You Slept Through's presentation of Men Without Women by Ernest Hemingway. Que te dice la patria? The road of the pass was hard and smooth, and not yet dusty in the early morning. Below were the hills with oak and chestnut trees, and far away below was the sea. On the other side were snowy mountains. We came down from the pass through wooded country. There were bags of charcoal piled beside the road, and through the trees we saw charcoal burners' huts. It was Sunday, and the road, rising and falling, but always dropping away from the altitude of the pass, went through the scrub woods and through villages. Outside the villages there were fields with vines. The fields were brown, and the vines coarse and thick. The houses were white, and in the streets the men, in their Sunday clothes, were playing bowls. Against the walls of some of the houses there were pear trees, their branches candelabraed against the white walls. The pear trees had been sprayed, and the walls of the houses were stained a metallic blue-green by the spray vapor. There were small clearings around the villages where the vines grew, and then the woods. In a village, 20 kilometers above Spezia, there was a crowd in the square, and a young man carrying a suitcase came up to the car and asked us to take him into Spezia. There are only 2 places, I said, and they are occupied. We had an old Ford coupe. I will ride on the outside. You will be uncomfortable. That makes nothing. I must go to Spezia. Should we take him? I asked Guy. He seems to be going anyway, Guy said. The young man handed in a parcel through the window. Look after this, he said. 2 men tied his suitcase on the back of the car above our suitcases. He shook hands with every one, explained that to a fascist and a man as used to traveling as himself, there was no discomfort, and climbed up on the running board on the left-hand side of the car, holding on inside, his right arm through the open window. You can start, he said. The crowd waved. He waved with his free hand. What did he say? Guy asked me. That we could start. Isn't he nice? Guy said. The road followed a river. Across the river were mountains. The sun was taking the frost out of the grass. It was bright and cold, and the air came cold through the open windshield. How do you think he likes it out there? Guy was looking up the road. His view out his side of the car was blocked by our guest. The young man projected from the side of the car like the figurehead of a ship. He had turned his coat collar up and pulled his hat down, and his nose looked cold in the wind. Maybe he'll get enough of it, Guy said. That's the side our bum tire's on. Oh, he'd leave us if we blew out, I said. He wouldn't get his traveling clothes dirty. Well, I don't mind him, Guy said, except the way he leans out on the turns. The woods were gone. The road had left the river to climb. The radiator was boiling. The young man looked annoyedly and suspiciously at the steam and rusty water. The engine was grinding, with both Guy's feet on the first speed pedal, up and up, back and forth and up, and finally, out level. The grinding stopped, and in the new quiet, there was a great churning, bubbling in the radiator. We were at the top of the last range above Spezia and the sea. The road descended with short, barely rounded turns. Our guest hung on the turns and nearly pulled the top-heavy car over. You can't tell him not to, I said to Guy. It's his sense of self-preservation. The great Italian sense. The greatest Italian sense. We came down around curves, through deep dust, the dust powdering the olive trees. Spezia spread below along the sea. The road flattened outside the town. Our guest put his head in the window. I want to stop. Stop it, I said to Guy. We slowed up at the side of the road. The young man got down, went to the back of the car and untied the suitcase. I'll stop here so you won't get into trouble carrying passengers, he said. My package. I handed him the package. He reached in his pocket. How much do I owe you? Nothing. Why not? I don't know, I said. Then thanks, the young man said. Not thank you, or thank you very much, or thank you 1,000 times, all of which you formerly said in Italy to a man when he handed you a timetable or explained about a direction. The young man uttered the lowest form of the word thanks and looked after us suspiciously as Guy started the car. I waved my hand at him. He was too dignified to reply. We went on to Spezia. That's a young man that will go a long way in Italy, I said to Guy. Well, said Guy, he went 20 kilometers with us. A meal in Spezia. We came into Spezia looking for a place to eat. The street was wide and the houses high and yellow. We followed the tram track into the center of town. On the walls of the houses were stenciled eye-bugging portraits of Mussolini, with hand-painted vivas, the double V in black paint, with drippings of paint down the wall. Side streets went down into the harbor. It was bright, and the people were all out for Sunday. The stone paving had been sprinkled, and there were damp stretches in the dust. We went close to the curb to avoid a tram. Let's eat somewhere simple, Guy said. We stopped opposite 2 restaurant signs. We were standing across the street, and I was buying the papers. The 2 restaurants were side by side. A woman standing in the doorway of one smiled at us, and we crossed the street and went in. It was dark inside, and at the back of the room 3 girls were sitting at a table with an old woman. Across from us, at another table, sat a sailor. He sat there neither eating nor drinking. Further back, a young man in a blue suit was writing at a table. His hair was pomaded and shining, and he was very smartly dressed and clean-cut looking. A light came through the doorway, and through the window were vegetables, fruits, steaks, and chops were arranged in a showcase. A girl came and took our order, and another girl stood in the doorway. We noticed that she wore nothing under her house dress. The girl who took our order put her arm around Guy's neck while we were looking at the menu. There were 3 girls in all, and they all took turns going and standing in the doorway. The old woman at the table in the back of the room spoke to them, and they sat down again with her. There was no doorway leading from the room except into the kitchen. A curtain hung over it. The girl who had taken our order came in from the kitchen with spaghetti. She put it on the table and brought a bottle of red wine and sat down at the table. Well, I said to Guy, you wanted to eat someplace simple. This isn't simple. This is complicated. What do you say? Asked the girl. Are you Germans? South Germans, I said. The South Germans are a gentle, lovable people. Don't understand, she said. What's the mechanics of this place? Guy asked. Do I have to let her put her arm around my neck? Certainly, I said. Mussolini has abolished the brothels. This is a restaurant. The girl wore a one-piece dress. She leaned forward against the table, put her hands on her breasts, and smiled. She smiled better on one side than the other, and turned the good side towards us. The charm of the good side had been enhanced by some event which had smoothed the other side of her nose in, as warm wax can be smoothed. Her nose, however, did not look like warm wax. It was very cold and firmed, only smoothed in. You like me? She asked Guy. He adores you, I said, but he doesn't speak Italian. Ich spreche Deutsch, she said, and stroked Guy's hair. Speak to the lady in your native tongue, Guy. Where do you come from? Asked the lady. Potsdam. And you will stay here now for a little while? In this so dear Spezia? I asked. Tell her we have to go, said Guy. Tell her we're very ill and I have no money. My friend is a misogynist, I said. An old German misogynist. Tell him I love him. I told him. Will you shut your mouth and get us out of here, Guy said. The lady had placed another arm around his neck. Tell him he is mine, she said. I told him. Will you get us out of here? You are quarreling, the lady said. You do not love one another. We are Germans, I said proudly. Old South Germans. Tell him he is a beautiful boy, the lady said. Guy is 38 and takes some pride in the fact that he is taken for a traveling salesman in France. You're a beautiful boy, I said. Who says so? Guy asked. You or her? She does. I'm just your interpreter. Isn't that what you got me in on this trip for? I'm glad it's her, said Guy. I didn't want to have to leave you here, too. I don't know. Spezia's a lovely place. Spezia, the lady said. You are talking about Spezia. Lovely place, I said. It is my country, she said. Spezia is my home, and Italy is my country. She says Italy's her country. Tell her it looks like her country, Guy said. What do you have for dessert, I asked. Fruit, she said. We have bananas. Bananas are all right, Guy said. They've got skids on. Oh, he takes bananas, the lady said. She embraced Guy. What does she say, he asked, keeping his face out of the way. She's pleased because you take bananas. Tell her I don't take bananas. The signor does not take bananas. Ah, said the lady, crestfallen. He doesn't take bananas. Tell her I take a cold bath every morning, Guy said. The signor takes a cold bath every morning. No understand, the lady said. Across from us, the property sailor had not moved. No one in the place paid any attention to him. We want the bill, I said. Oh no, you must stay. Listen, the clean-cut young man said from the table where he was writing. Let them go. These two are worth nothing. The lady took my hand. You won't stay? You won't ask him to stay? We have to go, I said. We have to get to Pisa, or, if possible, Firenze tonight. We can amuse ourselves in those cities at the end of the day. It is now the day. In the day, we must cover distance. To stay a little while is nice. To travel is necessary during the light of the day. Listen, the clean-cut young man said. Don't bother to talk with these two. I tell you they're worth nothing, and I know. Bring us the bill, I said. She brought the bill from the old woman and went back and sat at the table. Another girl came in from the kitchen. She walked the length of the room and stood in the doorway. Don't bother with these two, the clean-cut young man said in a weary voice. Come and eat. They're worth nothing. We paid the bill and stood up. All the girls, the old woman, and the clean-cut young man sat down at a table together. The property sailor sat with his head in his hands. No one had spoken to him all the time we were at lunch. The girl brought us our change that the old woman counted out for her and went back to her place at the table. We left a tip on the table and went out. When we were seated in the car and ready to start, the girl came out and stood in the door. We started, and I waved to her. She did not wave, but stood there, looking after us. After the rain. It was raining hard when we passed through the suburbs of Genoa, and even going very slowly behind the tram cars and the motor trucks, liquid mud splashed onto the sidewalks, so that people stepped into doorways as they saw us coming. In San Pier de Reina, the industrial suburb outside of Genoa, there's a wide street with 2 car tracks, and we drove down the center to avoid sending the mud onto the men going home from work. On our left was the Mediterranean. There was a big sea running, and waves broke, and the wind blew the spray against the car. A riverbed that, when we had passed going into Italy, had been wide, stony, and dry, was running brown, and up to the banks. The brown water discolored the sea. As the waves thinned and cleared and breaking, the light came through the yellow water, and the crests, detached by the wind, blew across the road. A big car passed us, going fast, and a sheet of muddy water rose up and over our windshield and radiator. The automatic windshield cleaner moved back and forth, spreading the film over the glass. We stopped and ate lunch at Sestri. There was no heat in the restaurant, and we kept our hats and coats on. We could see the car outside through the window. It was covered with mud and was stopped beside some boats that had been pulled up beyond the waves. In the restaurant, you could see your breath. The pasta asciutta was good. The wine tasted of alum, and we poured water in it. Afterward, the waiter brought beefsteak and fried potatoes. A man and woman sat in the far end of the restaurant. He was middle-aged, and she was young and wore black. All during the meal, she would blow out her breath in the cold, damp air. The man would look at it and shake his head. They ate without talking, and the man held her hand under the table. She was good-looking, and they seemed very sad. They had a traveling bag with them. We had the papers, and I read the account of the Shanghai fighting aloud to Guy. After the meal, he left with the waiter and searched for a place which did not exist in the restaurant, and I cleaned off the windshield, the lights, and the license plates with a rag. Guy came back, and we backed the car out and started. The waiter had taken him across the road into an old house. The people in the house were suspicious, and the waiter had remained with Guy to see that nothing was stolen. Although I don't know how, me not being a plumber, they expected me to steal anything, Guy said. As we came up on a headland beyond the town, the wind struck the car and nearly tipped it over. It's good it blows us away from the sea, Guy said. Well, I said, they drowned Shelley somewhere along here. I was down by Viareggio, Guy said. Do you remember what we came into this country for? Yes, I said, but we didn't get it. We'll be out of it tonight. If we can get past Ventimiglia. We'll see. I don't like to drive this coast at night. It was early afternoon and the sun was out. Below, the sea was blue with whitecaps running towards Savona. Back beyond the cape, the brown and blue waters joined. Out ahead of us, a tramp steamer was going up the coast. Can you still see Genoa? Guy asked. Oh, yes. That next big cape ought to put it out of sight. We'll see it a long time yet. I can still see Portofino Cape behind it. Finally, we could not see Genoa. I looked back as we came out, and there was only the sea, and below in the bay a line of beach with fishing boats, and above, on the side of a hill, a town, and then capes far down the coast. It's gone now, I said to Guy. Oh, it's been gone a long time now. But we couldn't be sure till we got way out. There was a sign with a picture of an S-turn and Svolta Pericosola. The road curved around the headland, and the wind blew through the crack in the windshield. Below, the cape was a flat stretch beside the sea. The wind had dried the mud, and the wheels were beginning to lift dust. On the flat road, we passed a fascist riding a bicycle, a heavy revolver and a holster on his back. He held the middle of the road on his bicycle, and we turned out for him. He looked up at us as we passed. Ahead, there was a railway crossing. As we came toward it, the gate went down. As we waited, the fascist came up on his bicycle. The train went by, and Guy started the engine. "Wait!" the bicycle man shouted from behind the car. "Your number's dirty." I got out with a rag. The number had been cleaned at lunch. "You can read it," I said. "You think so?" "Read it." "I cannot read it. It is dirty." I wiped it off with the rag. "How's that?" 25 lire. "What?" I said. "You could have read it. It's only dirty from the state of the roads." "You don't like Italian roads?" "They are dirty." 50 lire. He spat in the road. "Your car is dirty, and you are dirty too." "Good. And give me a receipt with your name." He took out a receipt book, made in duplicate, and perforated so that one side could be given to the customer, and the other side filled in and kept as a stub. There was no carbon to record what the customer's ticket said. "Give me 50 lire." He wrote in indelible pencil, tore out the slip, and handed it to me. I read it. "This is for 25 lire. "A mistake," he said, and changed the 25 to 50. "And now the other side. Make it 50 in the part you keep." He smiled a beautiful Italian smile and wrote something on the receipt stub, holding it so I could not see. "Go on," he said, "before your number gets dirty again." We drove for 2 hours after it was dark and slept in Mentone that night. It seemed very cheerful and clean and sane and lovely. We had driven from Ventimiglia to Pisa and Florence, across the Romagna to Rimini, and back through the Flori, Imola, Bologna, Parma, Piacenza, and Genoa, to Ventimiglia again. The whole trip had only taken 10 days. Naturally, in such a short trip, we had no opportunity to see how things were with the country or the people.
50 grand. How are you going yourself, Jack? I asked him. You seen this Walcott? He says. Just in the gym. Well, Jack says, I'm going to need a lot of luck with that boy. He can't hit you, Jack, Soldier said. I wish to hell he couldn't. He couldn't hit you with a handful of birdshot. Birdshot'd be all right, Jack says. I wouldn't mind birdshot any. He looks easy to hit, I said. Sure, Jack says. He ain't gonna last too long. He ain't gonna last like you and me, Jerry. But right now, he's got everything. You'll left-hand him to death. Maybe, Jack says. Sure, I got a chance to. Handle him like you handled Kid Lewis. Kid Lewis, Jack said. That Jew. The three of us, Jack Brennan, Soldier Bartlett, and I, were in Hanley's. There were a couple of broads sitting at the table next to us. They had been drinking. What do you mean, Jew? One of the broads said. What do you mean, Jew, you big Irish bum? Sure, Jack says. That's it. Jews, this broad goes on. They're always talking about Jews, these big Irishmen. What do you mean, Jews? Come on, let's get out of here. Jews, this broad goes on. Whoever saw you ever buy a drink? Your wife sews your pockets up every morning. These Irishmen and their Jews. Ted Lewis could lick you, too. Sure, says Jack. And you give away a lot of things for free, too, don't you? We went out. That was Jack. He could say what he wanted to when he wanted to say it. Jack started training out at Danny Hogan's health farm over in Jersey. It was nice out there, but Jack didn't like it much. He didn't like being away from his wife and the kids, and he was sore and grouchy most of the time. He liked me, and we got along fine together, and he liked Hogan, but after a while, Soldier Bartlett commenced to get on his nerves. A kidder gets to be an awful thing around the camp if his stuff goes sort of sour. Soldier was always kidding Jack, just sort of kidding him all the time. It wasn't very funny, and it wasn't very good, and it began to get to Jack. It was sort of stuff like this. Jack would finish up with the weights in the bag and pull on the gloves. You want to work? He'd say to Soldier. Sure, how you want me to work? Soldier would ask. Want me to treat you rough like Walcott? Want me to knock you down a few times? That's it, Jack would say. He didn't like it any, though. One morning, we were all out on the road. We'd been out quite a way, and now we were coming back. We'd gone along for 3 minutes, and then walk a minute, and then go fast for 3 minutes again. Jack wasn't ever what you would call a sprinter. He'd move around fast enough in the ring if he had to, but he wasn't any too fast on the road. All the time we were walking, Soldier was kidding him. We came up the hill to the farmhouse. Well, says Jack, you better go back to town, Soldier. What do you mean? You better go back to town and stay there. What's the matter? I'm sick of hearing you talk. Yes? Says Soldier. Yes, says Jack. You'll be a damn sight sicker when Walcott gets through with you. Sure, says Jack. Maybe I will, but I know I'm sick of you. So Soldier went off on the train to town that same morning. I went down with him to the train. He was good and sore. I was just kidding him, he said. We were waiting on the platform. He can't pull that stuff with me, Jerry. He's nervous and crabby, I said. He's a good fellow, Soldier. The hell he is. The hell he's ever been a good fellow. Well, I said, so long, Soldier. The train had come in. He climbed up with his bag. So long, Jerry, he says. You be in town before the fight? I don't think so. See you then. He went in and the conductor swung up and the train went out. I rode back to the farm in the cart. Jack was on the porch writing a letter to his wife. The mail had come, and I got the papers and went over on the other side of the porch and sat down to read. Hogan came out the door and walked over to me. Did he have a jam with Soldier? Not a jam, I said. He just told him to go back to town. I could see it coming, Hogan said. He never liked Soldier much. No, he don't like many people. He's a pretty cold one, Hogan said. Well, he's always been fine to me. Me too, Hogan said. I got no kick on him. He's a cold one, though. Hogan went in through the screen door, and I sat there on the porch and read the papers. It was just starting to get fall weather, and it's nice country there in Jersey, up in the hills, and after I read the paper through, I sat there and looked out at the country and the road down below against the woods with cars going along it, lifting the dust up. It was fine weather and pretty nice-looking country. Hogan came to the door, and I said, Say, Hogan, haven't you got anything to shoot out here? No, Hogan said, only sparrows. Seen the paper? I said to Hogan. What's in it? Sunday booted 3 of them in yesterday. I got that one on the telephone last night. You follow them pretty close, Hogan? I asked. Oh, I keep in touch with them, Hogan said. How about Jack? I says. Does he still play them? Him? Said Hogan. Can you see him doing it? Just then, Jack came around the corner with the letter in his hand. He's wearing a sweater and an old pair of pants and boxing shoes. Got a stamp, Hogan? He asks. Give me the letter, Hogan said. I'll mail it for you. Say, Jack, I said, didn't you used to play the ponies? Sure. I knew you did. I knew I used to see you out at the sheephead. What did you lay off 'em for? Hogan asked. Lost money. Jack sat down on the porch by me. He leaned back against a post. He shut his eyes in the sun. Want a chair? Hogan asked. No, said Jack. This is fine. It's a nice day, I said. It's pretty nice out in the country. I'd a damn sight rather be in town with the wife. Well, you only got another week. Yes, Jack says, that's so. We sat there on the porch. Hogan was inside at the office. What do you think about the shape I'm in? Jack asked me. Well, you can't tell, I said. You got a week to get around into form. Don't stall me. Well, I said, you're not right. I'm not sleeping, Jack said. You'll be all right in a couple of days. No, says Jack, I got the insomnia. What's on your mind? I miss the wife. Have her come out. No, I'm too old for that. We'll take a long walk before you turn in and get you good and tired. Tired? Jack says. I'm tired all the time. He was that way all week. He wouldn't sleep at night, and he'd get up in the morning feeling that way, you know, when you can't shut your hands. He's stale as a poorhouse cake, Hogan said. He's nothing. I've never seen Walcott, I said. He'll kill him, said Hogan. He'll tear him in two. Well, I said, everybody's got to get it sometime. Not like this, though, Hogan said. They'll think he never trained. It gives the farm a black eye. You hear what the reporters said about him? Didn't I? They said he was awful. They said they oughtn't to let him fight. Well, I said, they're always wrong, ain't they? Yes, said Hogan, but this time they're right. What the hell do they know about whether a man's right or not? Well, said Hogan, they're not such fools. All they did was pick Willard at Toledo. This Lardner, he's so wise now. Ask him about when he picked Willard at Toledo. He wasn't out, Hogan said. He only writes the big fights. I don't care who they are, I said. What the hell do they know? They can write maybe, but what the hell do they know? You don't think Jack's in any shape, do you? Hogan asked. No, he's through. All he needs is to have Corbett pick him to win for it to be all over. Well, Corbett'll pick him, Hogan says. Sure, he'll pick him. That night Jack didn't sleep any either. The next morning was the last day before the fight. After breakfast, we were out on the porch again. What do you think about, Jack, when you can't sleep? I said. Oh, I worry, Jack says. I worry about property I got up in the Bronx. I worry about property I got in Florida. I worry about the kids. I worry about the wife. Sometimes I think about fights. I think about that guy Ted Lewis and I get sore. I got some stocks and I worry about them. What the hell don't I think about? Well, I said, tomorrow night it'll all be over. Sure, said Jack. That always helps a lot, don't it? That just fixes everything all up, I suppose. Sure. He was sore all day. We didn't do any work. Jack just moved around a little to loosen up. He shadowboxed a few rounds. He didn't even look good doing that. He skipped the rope a little while. He couldn't sweat. He'd better not do any work at all, Hogan said. We're standing watching him skip the rope. Don't he ever sweat at all anymore? He can't sweat. Do you suppose he's got the con? He never had any trouble making weight, did he? No, he hasn't got any con. He just hasn't got anything inside anymore. He ought to sweat, said Hogan. Jack came over skipping the rope. He was skipping up and down in front of us, forward and back, crossing his arms every third time. Well, he says, what are you buzzards talking about? I don't think you ought to work anymore, Hogan says. You'll be stale. Wouldn't that be awful? Jack says, and skips away down the floor, slapping the rope hard. That afternoon, John Collins showed up out at the farm. Jack was up in his room. John came out in a car from town. He had a couple of friends with him. The car stopped, and they all got out. Where's Jack? John asked me. Up in his room, lying down. Lying down? Yes, I said. How is he? I looked at the two fellows that were there with John. They're friends of his, John said. He's pretty bad, I said. What's the matter with him? He don't sleep. Hell, said John. That Irishman could never sleep. He isn't right, I said. Hell, John said. He's never right. I've had him for 10 years, and he's never been right yet. The fellows who were with him laughed. I want you to shake hands with Mr. Morgan and Mr. Steinfeld, John said. This is Mr. Doyle. He's been training Jack. Glad to meet you, I said. Let's go up and see the boy, the fellow called Morgan said. Let's have a look at him, Steinfeld said. We all went upstairs. Where's Hogan? John asked. He's out in the barn with a couple of his customers, I said. You got many people out there now? John asked. Just 2. Pretty quiet, ain't it? Morgan said. Yes, I said. It's pretty quiet. We were outside Jack's room. John knocked on the door. There wasn't any answer. Maybe he's asleep, I said. What the hell's he sleeping in the daytime for? John turned the handle and we all went in. Jack was lying asleep on the bed. He was face down, and his face was in the pillow. Both his arms were around the pillow. Hey, Jack, John said to him. Jack's head moved a little on the pillow. Jack, John says, leaning over him. Jack just dug a little deeper into the pillow. John touched him on the shoulder. Jack sat up and looked at us. He hadn't shaved, and he was wearing an old sweater. Christ, why can't you let me sleep? He says to John. Don't be sore, John says. I didn't mean to wake you up. Oh, no, Jack says. Of course not. You know Morgan and Seinfeld, John said. Glad to see you, Jack says. How do you feel, Jack? Morgan asks him. Fine, Jack says. How the hell would I feel? You look fine, Steinfeld says. Yes, don't I, says Jack. Say, he says to John, you're my manager. You get a big enough cut. Why the hell don't you come out here when the reporters was out? You want Jerry and me to talk to them? I had Lou fighting in Philadelphia, John says. What the hell's that to me? Jack says. You're my manager. You get a big enough cut. Why the hell don't you come out here when the reporters was out? You want Jerry and me to talk to them? I had Lou fighting in Philadelphia, John says. What the hell's that to me? Jack says. You're my manager. You get a big enough cut, don't you? You aren't making any money in Philadelphia, are you? Why the hell aren't you out here when I ought to have you? Hogan was here. Hogan, Jack says. Hogan's dumb as I am. Soldier Bathlet was out here walking with you for a while, wasn't he? Steinfeld said to change the subject. Yes, he was out here, Jack says. He was out here all right. Say, Jerry, John said to me, would you go and find Hogan and tell him we want to see him in about a half an hour? Sure, I said. Why the hell can't he stick around? Jack says. Stick around, Jerry. Morgan and Steinfeld looked at each other. Quiet down, Jack, John said to him. I better go find Hogan, I said. All right, if you want to go, Jack says. None of these guys are going to send you away, though. I'll go find Hogan, I said. Hogan was out in the gym in the barn. He had a couple of his health farm patients with gloves on. Neither wanted to hit the other, for the fear the other would come back and hit him. That'll do, Hogan said when he saw me come in. You can stop the slaughter. You gentlemen take a shower and Bruce will rub you down. They climbed out through the ropes and Hogan came over to me. John Collins is out with a couple of friends to see Jack, I said. I saw them come up in the car. Who are the two fellows with John? They're what you call wise boys, Hogan said. Don't you know them two? No, I said. That's Happy Steinfeld and Lou Morgan. They got a pool room. I've been away a long time, I said. Sure, said Hogan. That Happy Steinfeld's a big operator. I've heard his name, I said. He's a pretty smooth boy, Hogan said. They're a couple of sharpshooters. Well, I said, they want to see us in half an hour. You mean they don't want to see us until a half an hour? That's it. Come in the office, Hogan said. To hell with those sharpshooters. After about 30 minutes or so, Hogan and I went upstairs. We knocked on Jack's door. They were talking inside the room. Wait a minute, somebody said. To hell with that stuff, Hogan said. When you want to see me, I'm down in the office. We heard the door unlock. Steinfeld opened it. Come in, Hogan, he says. We're all going to have a drink. Well, says Hogan, that's something. We went in. Jack was sitting on the bed. John and Morgan were sitting on a couple of chairs. Steinfeld was standing up. You're a pretty mysterious lot of boys, Hogan said. Hello, Danny, John says. Hello, Danny, Morgan says, and shakes hands. Jack doesn't say anything. He just sits there on the bed. He ain't with the others. He's all by himself. He was wearing an old blue jersey and pants and had on boxing shoes. He needed a shave. Steinfeld and Morgan were dressers. John was quite a dresser, too. Jack sat there looking Irish and tough. Steinfeld brought out a bottle, and Hogan brought in some glasses, and everybody had a drink. Jack and I took one, and the rest of them went on and had 2 or 3 each. Better save some for your ride back, Hogan said. Don't you worry. We got plenty, Morgan said. Jack hadn't drunk anything since the one drink. He was standing up and looking at them. Morgan was sitting on the bed where Jack had sat. Have a drink, Jack, John said and handed him the glass and the bottle. No, Jack said. I never liked to go to these wakes. They all laughed. Jack didn't laugh. They were all feeling pretty good when they left. Jack stood on the porch when they got into the car. They waved to him. So long, Jack said. We had supper. Jack didn't say anything all during the meal except, will you pass me this, or will you pass me that? The 2 health farm patients ate at the same table with us. They were pretty nice fellows. After we finished eating, we went out on the porch. It was dark early. Like to take a walk, Jerry? Jack asked. Sure, I said. We put on our coats and started out. It was quite a way down to the main road, and then we walked along the main road about 1.5 miles. Cars kept going by, and we would pull out to the side until they were passed. Jack didn't say anything. After we'd stepped out into the bushes to let a big car go by, Jack said, to hell with this walking. Come on, back to Hogan's. We went along a side road that cut up over the hill and cut across the fields back to Hogan's. We could see the lights of the house up on the hill. We came around to the front of the house, and there, standing in the doorway, was Hogan. Have a good walk? Hogan asked. Oh, fine, Jack said. Listen, Hogan, have you got any liquor? Sure, says Hogan. What's the idea? Send it up to the room, Jack says. I'm going to sleep tonight. You're the doctor, Hogan says. Come on up to the room, Jerry, Jack says. Upstairs, Jack sat on the bed with his head in his hands. Ain't it a life, Jack says. Hogan brought in a quart of liquor and 2 glasses. Want some ginger ale? What do you think I want to do, get sick? I just asked you, said Hogan. Have a drink? said Jack. No, thanks, said Hogan. He went out. How about you, Jerry? I'll have one with you, I said. Jack poured out a couple of drinks. Now, he said, I want to take it slow and easy. Put some water in it, I said. Yes, Jack said. I guess that's better. We had a couple of drinks without saying anything. Jack started to pour me another. No, I said, that's all I want. All right, Jack said. He poured himself out another big shot and put water in it. He was lighting up a little. That was a fine bunch out here this afternoon, he said. They don't take any chances, those two. Then a little later, well, he says, they're right. What the hell's the good in taking chances? Don't you want another, Jerry? He said. Come on, drink along with me. I don't need it, Jack, I said. I feel all right. Just have one more, Jack said. It was softening him up. All right, I said. Jack poured one for me and another big one for himself. You know, he said, I like liquor pretty well. If I hadn't been boxing, I would have been drunk quite a lot. Sure, I said. You know, he said, I missed a lot, boxing. You made plenty of money. Sure, that's what I'm after. You know I miss a lot, Jerry. How do you mean? Well, he says, like about the wife and being away from home so much. It don't do my girls any good. Who's your old man? Some of those society kids will say to them. My old man's Jack Brennan. That don't do them any good. Hell, I said, all that makes a difference is if they got dough. Well, says Jack, I got the dough for them all right. He poured out another drink. The bottle was about empty. Put some water in it, I said. Jack poured in some water. You know, he says, you ain't got any idea how I miss the wife. Sure, you ain't got any idea. You can't have any idea what it's like. It ought to be better out in the country than in town. With me now, Jack said, it don't make any difference where I am. You can't have an idea what it's like. Have another drink. Am I getting soused? Do I talk funny? You're coming on all right. You can't have an idea what it's like. Anybody can have an idea what it's like. Except the wife, I said. She knows, Jack said. She knows all right. She knows. You bet she knows. Put some water in that, I said. Jerry, says Jack, you can't have an idea what it gets to be like. He was good and drunk. He was looking at me steady. His eyes were sort of too steady. You'll sleep all right, I said. Listen, Jerry, Jack says. You want to make some money? Get some money down on Walcott. Yes? Listen, Jerry, Jack put down the glass. I'm not drunk now, see? You know what I'm betting on him? 50 grand. That's a lot of dough. 50 grand, Jack says. At 2-1, I'll get $25,000. Get some money on him, Jerry. It sounds good, I said. How can I beat him? Jack says. It ain't crooked. How can I beat him? Why not make money on it? Put some water in that, I said. I'm through after this fight, Jack says. I'm through with it. I gotta take a beating. Why shouldn't I make money on it? Sure. I ain't slept for a week, Jack says. All night I lay awake and worry my can off. I can't sleep, Jerry. You ain't got an idea what it's like when you can't sleep. Sure. I can't sleep. That's all. I just can't sleep. What's the use of taking care of yourself all these years when you can't sleep? It's bad. You ain't got an idea what it's like, Jerry, when you can't sleep. Put some water in that, I said. Well, about 11 o'clock, Jack passes out, and I put him to bed. Finally, he's so he can't keep from falling asleep. I helped him get his clothes off and got him into bed. You'll sleep all right, Jack, I said. Sure, Jack says. I'll sleep now. Good night, Jack, I said. Good night, Jerry, Jack says. You're the only friend I got. Oh, hell, I said. You're the only friend I got, Jack says. The only friend I got. Go to sleep, I said. I'll sleep, Jack says. Downstairs, Hogan was sitting at the desk in the office reading the papers. He looked up. "Well, you get your boyfriend off to sleep?" he asks. "He's off." "It's better for him than not sleeping," Hogan said. "Sure." "You'd have a hell of a time explaining that to these sport riders, though," Hogan said. "Well, I'm going to bed myself," I said. "Good night," said Hogan. In the morning, I came downstairs about 8 o'clock and got some breakfast. Hogan had his 2 customers out in the barn doing exercises. I went out and watched them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hogan was counting for them. "Hello, Jerry," he said. "Is Jack up yet?" "No, he's still sleeping." I went back to my room and packed up to go into town. About 9:30, I heard Jack getting up in the next room. When I heard him go downstairs, I went after him. Jack was sitting at the breakfast table. Hogan had come in and was standing beside the table. "How do you feel, Jack?" I asked him. "Not so bad." "Sleep well?" Hogan asked. "I slept all right," Jack said. "I got a thick tongue, but I ain't got a head." "Good," said Hogan. "That was good liquor." "Put it on the bill," Jack says. "What time you want to go into town?" Hogan asked. "Before lunch," Jack says. "The 11 o'clock train." "Sit down, Jerry," Jack said. Hogan went out. I sat down at the table. Jack was eating a grapefruit. When he'd find a seed, he'd spit it out into the spoon and dump it onto the plate. "I guess I was pretty stewed last night," he said. "You drank some liquor. I guess I said a lot of fool things. You weren't bad." "Where's Hogan?" he asked. He was through with the grapefruit. "He's out in the front office." "What did I say about betting on the fight?" Jack asked. He was holding the spoon and sort of poking at the grapefruit with it. The girl came in with some ham and eggs and took away the grapefruit. "Bring me another glass of milk," Jack said to her. She went out. "You said you had 50 grand on Walcott," I said. "That's right," Jack said. "That's a lot of money." "I don't feel too good about it," Jack said. "Something might happen." "No," Jack said. "He wants the title bad. They'll be shooting with him all right." "You can't ever tell." "No, he wants the title. It's worth a lot of money to him." 50 grand is a lot of money," I said. "It's business," said Jack. "I can't win. You know I can't win anyway." "As long as you're in there, you got a chance." "No," Jack says. "I'm all through. It's just business." "How do you feel?" "Pretty good," Jack said. "The sleep was what I needed." "You might go good." "I'll give him a good show," Jack said. After breakfast, Jack called up his wife on the long distance. He was inside the booth telephoning. "That's the first time he's called her up since he's out here," Hogan said. "He writes her every day." "Sure," Hogan says. "A letter only costs 2 cents. Hogan said goodbye to us and Bruce and drove us down to the train in the cart. "Goodbye, Mr. Brennan," Bruce said at the train. "I sure hope you knock his can off." "So long," Jack said. He gave Bruce $2. Bruce had worked on him a lot. He looked kind of disappointed. Jack saw me looking at Bruce holding the $2. "It's all in the bill," he said. "Hogan charged me for the rubbing." On the train going into town, Jack didn't talk. He sat in the corner of the seat with his ticket in his hat band and looked out of the window. Once, he turned and spoke to me. "I told the wife I'd take a room at the Shelby tonight," he said. "It's just around the corner from the garden. I can go up to the house tomorrow morning." "That's a good idea," I said. "Your wife ever see you fight, Jack?" "No," Jack says. "She never see me fight." I thought he must be figured on taking an awful beating if he doesn't want to go home afterward. In town, we took a taxi up to the Shelby. A boy came out and took our bags, and we went into the desk. "How much are the rooms?" Jack asked. "We only have double rooms," the clerk says. "I can give you a nice double room for $10. "That's too steep. I can give you a double room for $7. "With a bath?" "Certainly." "You might as well bunk with me, Jerry," Jack says. "Oh," I said. "I'll sleep down at my brother-in-law's." "I don't mean for you to pay for it," Jack says. "I just want to get my money's worth." "Will you register, please?" the clerk says. He took the names. "Number 238, Mr. Brennan." We went up in the elevator. It was a nice big room with 2 beds and a door opening into a bathroom. "This is pretty good," Jack says. The boy who brought us up pulled the curtains and brought in our bags. Jack didn't make any move, so I gave the boy a quarter. We washed up, and Jack said we better go out and get something to eat. We ate lunch at Jimmy Hanley's place. Quite a lot of the boys were there. When we were about halfway through eating, John came in and sat down with us. Jack didn't talk much. "How are you on the weight, Jack?" John asked. Jack was putting away a pretty good lunch. "I could make it with my clothes on," Jack said. He never had to worry about taking weight off. He was a natural welterweight, and he'd never gotten fat. He just lost weight out at Hogan's. "Well, that's one thing you never had to worry about," John said. "That's one thing," Jack says. We went around to the garden to weigh in after lunch. The match was made at 147 pounds at 3 o'clock. Jack stepped on the scales with a towel around him. The bar didn't move. Walcott had just weighed and was standing with a lot of people around him. "Let's see what you weigh, Jack," Friedman, Walcott's manager, said. "All right, weigh him then." Jack jerked his head toward Walcott. "Drop the towel," Friedman said. "What do you make it?" Jack asked the fellows who were weighing. 143 pounds, the fat man who was weighing said. "You're down fine, Jack," Friedman says. "Weigh him," Jack says. Walcott came over. He was a blonde with wide shoulders and arms like a heavyweight. He didn't have much legs. Jack stood about half a head taller than he did. "Hello, Jack," he said. His face was plenty marked up. "Hello," said Jack. "How do you feel?" "Good," Walcott says. He dropped the towel from around his waist and stood on the scales. He had the widest shoulders and back you ever saw. 146 pounds, 12 ounces. Walcott stepped off and grinned at Jack. "Well," John says to him, "Jack's spotting you about 4 pounds. "More than that when I come in, kid," Walcott says. "I'm going to go and eat now." We went back and Jack got dressed. "He's a pretty tough-looking boy," Jack says to me. "He looks as though he'd been hit plenty of times." "Oh, yes," Jack says. "He ain't hard to hit." "Where are you going?" John asked when Jack was dressed. "Back to the hotel," Jack says. "You looked after everything?" "Yes," John says. "It's all looked after." "I'm going to lie down a while," Jack says. "I'll come around for you about 6:45 and we'll go and eat." "All right." Up at the hotel, Jack took off his shoes and his coat and lay down for a while. I wrote a letter. I looked over a couple of times and Jack wasn't sleeping. He was lying perfectly still, but every once in a while his eyes would open. Finally, he sits up. "Want to play some cribbage, Jerry?" he says. "Sure," I said. He went over to his suitcase and got out the cards and the cribbage board. We played cribbage, and he won $3 off me. John knocked at the door and came in. "Want to play some cribbage, John?" Jack asked him. John put his Kelly down on the table. It was all wet. His coat was wet, too. "Is it raining?" Jack asks. "It's pouring," John says. "The taxi I had got tied up in the traffic, and I got out and walked." "Come on, play some cribbage," Jack says. "You ought to go out and eat." "No," says Jack. "I don't want to eat yet." So they played cribbage for about half an hour, and Jack won $1.50 off him. "Well, I suppose we got to go eat," Jack says. He went to the window and looked out. "Is it still raining?" "Yes." "Let's eat in the hotel," John says. "All right," Jack says. "I'll play you once more and see who pays for the meal." After a little while, Jack gets up and says, "You buy the meal, John." And we went downstairs and ate in the big dining room. After we ate, we went upstairs and Jack played cribbage with John again and won $2.50 off him. Jack was feeling pretty good. John had a bag with him and all his stuff was in it. Jack took off his shirt and collar and put on a jersey and a sweater so he wouldn't catch cold when he came out, and he put his ring clothes and his bathrobe in a bag. "You all ready?" John asks him. "I'll call up and have them get a taxi." Pretty soon the telephone rang and they said the taxi was waiting. We rode down in the elevator and went out through the lobby and got in a taxi and rode around to the garden. It was raining hard, but there was a lot of people outside on the streets. The garden was sold out. As we came in and on our way to the dressing room, I saw how full it was. It looked like a half-mile down to the ring. It was all dark. Just the lights over the ring. "It's a good thing with this rain they didn't try and pull this fight in the ballpark," John said. "They got a good crowd," Jack says. This is a fight that would draw a lot more than the garden could hold. You can't tell about the weather, Jack says. John came to the door of the dressing room and poked his head in. Jack was sitting there with his bathrobe on. He had his arms folded and was looking at the floor. John had a couple of handlers with him. They looked over his shoulder. Jack looked up. Is he in? He asked. He's just gone down, John said. We started down. Walcott was just getting into the ring. The crowd gave him a big hand. He climbed through between the ropes and put his 2 fists together and smiled and shook them at the crowd, first at one side of the ring, then at the other, and then sat down. Jack got a good hand coming down through the crowd. Jack is Irish, and the Irish always get a pretty good hand. An Irishman don't draw in New York like a Jew or an Italian, but they always get a good hand. Jack climbed up and bent down to go through the ropes, and Walcott came over from his corner and pushed the rope down for Jack to go through. The crowd thought that was wonderful. Walcott put his hand on Jack's shoulder, and they stood there just for a second. So you're going to be one of these popular champions, Jack says to him. Take your goddamn hand off my shoulder. Be yourself, Walcott says. This is all great for the crowd. How gentlemanly the boys are before the fight. How they wish each other luck. Solly Friedman came over to our corner while Jack is bandaging his hands, and John is over in Walcott's corner. Jack puts his thumb through the slit in the bandage and then wraps his hand nice and smooth. I taped it around the wrist and twice across the knuckles. Hey, Friedman says, where do you get all that tape? Feel of it, Jack says. It's soft, ain't it? Don't be a hick. Friedman stands there all the time while Jack bandages the other hand, and one of the boys that's going to handle him brings the gloves, and I pull them on and work them around. Say, Friedman, Jack asks, what nationality is Walcott? I don't know, Solly says. He's some sort of Dane. He's a Bohemian, the lad said, who brought the gloves over. The referee called them out to the center of the ring, and Jack walks out. Walcott comes out smiling. They met, and the referee put his arm on each of their shoulders. Hello, popularity, Jack says to Walcott. Be yourself. What do you call yourself Walcott for, Jack says. Didn't you know he was from Jersey? Listen, says the referee, and he gives him the same old line. Once, Walcott interrupts him. He grabs Jack's arm and says, Can I hit him when he's got me like this? Keep your hands off me, Jack says. There ain't no moving pictures of this. They went back to their corners. I lifted the bathrobe off Jack, and he leaned on the ropes and flexed his knees a couple of times and scuffed his shoes on the rosin. The gong rang, and Jack turned quick and went out. Walcott came toward him, and they touched gloves. As soon as Walcott dropped his hands, Jack jumped his left into his face twice. There wasn't anybody ever boxed better than Jack. Walcott was after him, going forward all the time with his chin on his chest. He's a hooker, and he carries his hands pretty low. All he knows is to get in there and sock, but every time he gets in there close, Jack has the left hand in his face. It's just as though it's automatic. Jack just raises the left hand up, and it's in Walcott's face. 3 or 4 times, Jack brings the right over, but Walcott gets it on the shoulder or high up on the head. He's just like all these hookers. The only thing he's afraid of is another one of the same kind. He's covered everywhere you can hurt him. He don't care about a left hand in his face. After about 4 rounds, Jack has him bleeding bad and his face all cut up. But every time Walcott's got in close, he socks so hard he's got 2 big red patches on both sides, just below Jack's ribs. Every time he gets in close, Jack ties him up, and then gets one hand loose and uppercuts him. But when Walcott gets his hands loose, he socks Jack in the body so they can hear it outside in the street. He's a socker. It goes along like that for 3 rounds more. They don't talk any. They're working all the time. We worked over Jack plenty too in between the rounds. He don't look it at all, but he never does much work in the ring. He doesn't move around much, and that left hand is just automatic. It's just like it was connected with Walcott's face, and Jack just had to wish it in every time. Jack is always calm, in close, and he doesn't waste any juice. He knows everything about working in close too, and he's getting away with a lot of stuff. While they were in our corner, I watched him tie Walcott up, get his right hand loose and turn it and come up with an uppercut that got Walcott's nose with the heel of the glove. Walcott was bleeding bad and leaned his nose on Jack's shoulder so as to give Jack some of it too. And Jack sort of lifted his shoulder sharp and caught him against the nose, and then brought down the right hand and did the same thing again. Walcott was sore as hell. By the time they'd gone 5 rounds, he hated Jack's guts. Jack wasn't sore. That is, he wasn't any sorer than he always was. He certainly did used to make the fellows he fought hate boxing. That was why he hated Kid Lewis so. He never got the kid's goat. Kid Lewis always had about 3 new dirty things Jack couldn't do. Jack was as safe as a church all the time he was in there, as long as he was strong. He certainly was treating Walcott rough. The funny thing was, it looked as though Jack was an open classic boxer. That was because he had all that stuff, too. After the 7th round, Jack says, "My left's getting heavy." From then, he started to take a beating. It didn't show at first, but instead of him running the fight, it was Walcott running it. Instead of being safe all the time, now he was in trouble. He couldn't keep him out with the left hand now. It looked as though it was the same as ever, only now instead of Walcott's punches just missing him, they were just hitting him. He took an awful beating in the body. "What's the round?" Jack asked. "The 11th. I can't stay," Jack says. "My legs are going bad." Walcott had just been hitting him for a long time. It was like a baseball catcher pulls the ball and takes some of the shock off. From now on, Walcott commenced to land solid. He certainly was a socking machine. Jack was trying to block everything now. It didn't show what an awful beating he was taking. In between rounds, I worked on his legs. The muscles would flutter under my hands all the time I was rubbing them. He was sick as hell. "How's it go?" he asked John, turning around, his face all swollen. It's his fight. "I think I can last," Jack says. "I don't want this bohunk to stop me." It was going just the way he thought it would. He knew he couldn't beat Walcott. He wasn't strong anymore. He was all right, though. His money was all right, and now he wanted to finish it off right to please himself. He didn't want to be knocked out. The gong rang, and we pushed him out. He went out slow. Walcott came right out after him. Jack put the left in his face, and Walcott took it, came in under it, and started working on Jack's body. Jack tried to tie him up, and it was just like trying to hold on to a buzzsaw. Jack broke away from it and missed with the right. Walcott clipped him with a left hook, and Jack went down. He went down on his hands and knees and looked at us. The referee started counting. Jack was watching us and shaking his head. At 8, John motioned to him. You couldn't hear on account of the crowd. Jack got up. The referee had been holding Walcott back with one arm while he counted. When Jack was on his feet, Walcott started toward him. "Watch yourself, Jimmy," I heard Solly Friedman yell to him. Walcott came up to Jack, looking at him. Jack struck the left hand at him. Walcott just shook his head. He backed Jack up against the ropes, measured him, and then hooked the left very light to the side of Jack's head and socked the right into his body as hard as he could sock, just as low as he could get it. He must have hit him 5 inches below the belt. I thought the eyes would come out of Jack's head. They stuck way out. His mouth come open. The referee grabbed Walcott. Jack stepped forward. If he went down, there went $50,000. He walked as though all his insides were going to fall out. "It wasn't low," he said. "It was an accident." The crowd was yelling so loud you couldn't hear anything. "I'm all right," Jack says. They were right in front of us. The referee looks at John, and then he shakes his head. "Come on, you pole-lock son of a bitch," Jack says to Walcott. John was hanging onto the ropes. He had the towel ready to chuck it in. Jack was standing just a little way out from the ropes. He took a step forward. I saw the sweat come out on his face like somebody had squeezed it, and a big drop went down his nose. "Come on and fight," Jack says to Walcott. The referee looked at John and waved Walcott on. "Go in there, you slob," he says. Walcott went in. He didn't know what to do either. He never thought Jack could have stood it. Jack put the left in his face. There was such a hell of a lot of yelling going on. They were right in front of us. Walcott hit him twice. Jack's face was the worst thing I ever saw. The look on it. He was holding himself and all his body together, and it all showed on his face. All the time he was thinking and holding his body in where it was busted. Then he started to sock. His face looked awful all the time. He started to sock with his hands low down by his side, swinging at Walcott. Walcott covered up, and Jack was swinging wild at Walcott's head. Then he swung the left, and it hit Walcott in the groin, and then it hit Walcott right bang where he'd hit Jack, way low below the belt. Walcott went down and grabbed himself there and rolled and twisted around. The referee grabbed Jack and pushed him towards his corner. John jumps into the ring. There was all this yelling going on. The referee was talking with the judges, and then the announcer got into the ring with the megaphone and says, "Walcott on a foul." The referee is talking to John, and he says, "What could I do? Jack wouldn't take the foul. Then when he's groggy, he fouls him." "He'd lost it anyway," John says. Jack's sitting on the chair. I've got his gloves off, and he's holding himself down there with both hands. When he's got something supporting his face, he doesn't look so bad. "Go over and say you're sorry," John says into his ear. "It'll look good." Jack stands up, and the sweat comes out all over his face. I put the bathrobe around him, and he holds himself in with one hand under the bathrobe and goes across the ring. They've picked Walcott up, and they're working on him. There's a lot of people in Walcott's corner. Nobody speaks to Jack. He leans over to Walcott. "I'm sorry," Jack says. "I didn't mean to foul you." Walcott doesn't say anything. He looks too damn sick. "Well, you're the champion now," Jack says to him. "I hope you get a hell of a lot of fun out of it." "Leave the kid alone," Solly Friedman says. "Hello, Solly," Jack says. "I'm sorry I fouled your boy." Friedman just looks at him. Jack went to his corner, walking that funny, jerky way, and we got him down through the ropes and through the reporters' tables and out down the aisle. A lot of people wanted to slap Jack on the back. He goes out through all that mob in his bathrobe to the dressing room. It's a popular win for Walcott. That's the way the money was bet in the garden. Once we got inside the dressing room, Jack lay down and shut his eyes. "We want to get to the hotel and get a doctor," John says. "I'm all busted inside," Jack says. "I'm sorry as hell, Jack," John says. "It's all right," Jack says. He lies there with his eyes shut. "They certainly tried a nice double cross," John said. "Your friends Morgan and Steinfeld," Jack said. "You got some nice friends." He lies there. His eyes are open now. His face has still got that awful, drawn look. "It's funny how fast you can think when it means that much money," Jack says. "You're some boy, Jack," John says. "No," Jack says. "It was nothing."
A Simple Enquiry. Outside, the snow was higher than the window. The sunlight came in through the window and shone on the map on the pine board wall of the hut. The snow was high, and the light came in over the top of the snow. A trench had been cut along the open side of the hut, and each clear day the sun, shining on the wall, reflected heat against the snow and widened the trench. It was late March. The major sat at a table against the wall. His adjutant sat at another table. Around the major's eyes were two white circles where his snow glasses had protected his face from the sun on the snow. The rest of his face had been burned, and then tanned, and then burned through the tan. His nose was swollen, and there were edges of loose skin where blisters had been. While he worked at the papers, he put the fingers of his left hand into a saucer of oil, and then spread oil over his face, touching it very gently with the tips of his fingers. He was very careful to drain his fingers on the edge of the saucer, so there was only a film of oil on them, and after he'd stroked his forehead and his cheeks, he stroked his nose very delicately between his fingers. When he'd finished, he stood up, took the saucer of oil, and went into the small room of the hut where he slept. "I'm going to take a little sleep," he said to the adjutant. In that army, an adjutant is not a commissioned officer. "You will finish up." "Yes, Signor Maggiore," the adjutant answered. He leaned back in his chair and yawned. He took a paper-covered book out of the pocket of his coat and opened it, then laid it down on the table and lit his pipe. He leaned forward on the table to read and puffed at his pipe. Then he closed the book and put it back in his pocket. He had too much paperwork to get through. He could not enjoy reading until it was done. Outside, the sun went behind a mountain, and there was no more light on the wall of the hut. A soldier came in and put some pine branches, chopped into irregular lengths, into the stove. "Be soft, Pinin," the adjutant said to him. "The major is sleeping." Pinin was the major's orderly. He was a dark-faced boy, and he fixed the stove, putting the pine wood in carefully, shut the door, and went into the back of the hut again. The adjutant went on with his papers. "Tonani," the major called. "Signor Maggiore?" "Send Pinin in to me." "Pinin!" the adjutant called. Pénine came into the room. "The major wants you," the adjutant said. Pénine walked across the main room of the hut toward the major's door. He knocked on the half-opened door. "Signor Maggiore?" "Come in," the adjutant heard the major say, "and shut the door." Inside the room, the major lay on his bunk. Pénine stood beside the bunk. The major lay with his head on the rucksack that he had stuffed with spare clothing to make a pillow. His long, burned, oiled face looked at Pénine. His hands lay on the blankets. "You are 19, he asked. "Yes, Signor Maggiore." "You have ever been in love?" "How do you mean, Signor Maggiore?" "In love. With a girl?" "I have been with girls." "I did not ask that. I asked if you had been in love. With a girl." "Yes, Signor Maggiore." "You are in love with this girl now?" "You don't write her. I read all your letters." "I am in love with her," Pénine said, "but I do not write her." "You are sure of this?" "I am sure." "Tonani," the major said in the same tone of voice, "can you hear me talking?" There was no answer from the next room. "He cannot hear," the major said. "And you are quite sure that you love a girl?" "I am sure." "And," the major looked at him quickly, "that you are not corrupt?" "I don't know what you mean, corrupt." "All right," the major said. "You needn't be superior." Pénine looked at the floor. The major looked at his brown face, down and up him, and at his hands. Then he went on, not smiling. "And you don't really want—" The major paused. Pénine looked at the floor. "That your great desire isn't really—" Pénine looked at the floor. The major leaned his head back on the rucksack and smiled. He was really relieved. Life in the army was too complicated. "You're a good boy," he said. "You're a good boy, Pénine. But don't be superior, and be careful someone else doesn't come along and take you." Pénine stood still beside the bunk. "Don't be afraid," the major said. His hands were folded on the blankets. "I won't touch you. You can go back to your platoon if you like, but you'd better stay on as my servant. You've less chance of being killed." "Do you want anything of me, Signor Maggiore?" "No," the major said. "Go on and get on with whatever you are doing. Leave the door open when you go out." Pénine went out, leaving the door open. The adjutant looked up at him as he walked awkwardly across the room and out the door. Pénine was flushed and moved differently than he had moved when he brought in the wood for the fire. The adjutant looked after him and smiled. Pénine came in with more wood for the stove. The major, lying on his bunk, looking at his cloth-covered helmet and his snow glasses that hung from a nail on the wall, heard him walk across the floor. "The little devil," he thought. "I wonder if he lied to me." 10 Indians. After one 4th of July, Nick, driving home late from town in a big wagon with Joe Garner and his family, passed 9 drunken Indians along the road. He remembered there were 9 because Joe Garner, driving along in the dusk, pulled up the horses, jumped down into the road, and dragged an Indian out of the wheel rut. The Indian had been asleep, face down in the sand. Joe dragged him into the bushes and got back up on the wagon box. "That makes 9 of them," Joe said, "just between here and the edge of town." "Them Indians," said Mrs. Gardner. Nick was on the back seat with the 2 Gardner boys. He was looking out from the back seat to see the Indian where Joe had dragged him alongside the road. "Was it Billy Tabishaw?" Carl asked. "No. His pants looked mighty like Billy. All Indians wear the same kind of pants." "I didn't see him at all," Frank said. "Pa was down to the road and back up again before I seen a thing. I thought he was killing a snake." "Plenty of Indians will kill snakes tonight, I guess," Joe Garner said. "Them Indians," said Mrs. Garner. They drove along. The road turned off from the main highway and went up into the hills. It was a hard pulling for the horses, and the boys got down and walked. The road was sandy. Nick looked back from the top of the hill by the schoolhouse. He saw the lights of Petoskey, and off across Little Traverse Bay, the lights of Harbor Springs. They climbed back into the wagon again. "They ought to put some gravel on that stretch," Joe Garner said. The wagon went along the road through the woods. Joe and Mrs. Garner sat close together on the front seat. Nick sat between the two boys. The road came out into a clearing. "Right here's where Pa ran over a skunk. It was further on." "It don't make no difference where it was," Joe said without turning his head. "One place is just as good as another to run over a skunk." "I saw 2 skunks last night," Nick said. "Where?" "Down by the lake. They were looking for dead fish along the beach." "They were coons, probably," Carl said. "They were skunks. I guess I know skunks." "You ought to," Carl said. "You got an Indian girl." "Stop talking that way, Carl," said Mrs. Garner. "Well, they smell about the same." Joe Garner laughed. "You stop laughing, Joe," Mrs. Garner said. "I won't have Carl talk that way." "Have you got an Indian girl, Nicky?" Joe asked. "No." "He has too, Pa," Frank said. "Prudence Mitchell's his girl." "She's not." "He goes to see her every day." "I don't." Nick, sitting between the two boys in the dark, felt hollow and happy inside himself to be teased about Prudence Mitchell. "She ain't my girl," he said. "Listen to him," said Carl. "I see 'em together every day." "Carl can't get a girl," his mother said. "Not even a squaw." Carl was quiet. "Carl ain't no good with girls," Frank said. "You shut up." "You're all right, Carl," Joe Gardner said. "Girls never got a man anywhere. Look at your pa." "Yes, that's what you would say." Mrs. Gardner moved close to Joe as the wagon jolted. "Well, you had plenty of girls in your time. I'll bet Pa would never had a squaw for a girl." "Don't you think it," Joe said. "You better watch out to keep Prudy, Nick." His wife whispered to him, and Joe laughed. "What are you laughing at?" asked Frank. "Don't you say it, Garner," his wife warned. Joe laughed again. "Nicky can have Prudence," Joe Garner said. "I got a good girl." "That's the way to talk," Mrs. Garner said. The horses were pulling heavily in the sand. Joe reached out in the dark with his whip. "Come on, pull into it. You'll have to pull harder than this tomorrow." They trotted down the long hill, the wagon jolting. At the farmhouse, everybody got down. Mrs. Gardner unlocked the door, went inside, and came out with a lamp in her hand. Carl and Nick unloaded the things from the back of the wagon. Frank sat on the front seat to drive to the barn and put up the horses. Nick went up the steps and opened the kitchen door. Mrs. Gardner was building a fire in the stove. She turned from pouring kerosene on the wood. "Goodbye, Mrs. Gardner," Nick said. "Thanks for taking me." "Oh, shucks, Nicky." "I had a wonderful time." "We'd like to have you. Won't you stay and eat some supper?" "I better go. I think Dad probably waited for me." "Well, get along, then. Send Carl up to the house, will you?" "All right. Night, Nicky." "Good night, Mrs. Gardner." Nick went out to the farmyard and down to the barn. Joe and Frank were milking. "Good night," Nick said. "Had a swell time." "Good night, Nick," Joe Gardner called. "Aren't you going to stay and eat?" "No, I can't. Will you tell Carl his mother wants him?" "All right. Good night, Nicky." Nick walked barefoot along the path through the meadow below the barn. The path was smooth, and the dew was cool on his bare feet. He climbed a fence at the end of the meadow, went down through a ravine, his feet wet in the swamp mud, and then climbed up through the dry beech woods until he saw the lights of the cottage. He climbed over the fence and walked around to the front porch. Through the window he saw his father sitting by the table, reading in the light from the big lamp. Nick opened the door and went in. "Well, Nicky," his father said, "was it a good day?" "I had a swell time, Dad. It was a swell 4th of July. "Are you hungry?" "You bet." "What'd you do with your shoes?" "I left them in the wagon at Gardner's." "Come on out to the kitchen." Nick's father went ahead with the lamp. He stopped and lifted the lid of the icebox. Nick went on into the kitchen. His father brought in a piece of cold chicken on a plate and a pitcher of milk and put them on the table before Nick. He put down the lamp. "Well, there's some pie, too," he said. "Will that hold you?" "It's grand." His father sat down in a chair beside the oilcloth-covered table. He made a big shadow on the kitchen wall. "Who won the ball game?" "Petoskey, 5-3. His father sat watching him eat and filled his glass from the milk pitcher. Nick drank and wiped his mouth on his napkin. His father reached over to the shelf for the pie. He cut Nick a big piece. It was huckleberry pie. "What did you do, Dad?" "I went out fishing in the morning." "What'd you get?" "Only perch." His father sat watching Nick eat the pie. "What'd you do this afternoon?" Nick asked. "I went for a walk up by the Indian camp." "Did you see anybody?" "The Indians were all in town getting drunk." "Didn't you see anybody at all?" "I saw your friend Prudy." "Where was she?" "She was in the woods with Frank Washburn. I ran onto them. They were having quite a time." His father was not looking at him. "What were they doing?" "I didn't stay to find out." "Tell me what they were doing." "I don't know," his father said. "I just heard them threshing around." "Well, how'd you know it was them?" "I saw them." "I thought you said you didn't see them." "Oh, yes, I saw them." "Who was it with her?" Nick asked. "Frank Washburn." Were they what? Were they happy?" "I guess so." His father got up from the table and went out the kitchen screen door. When he came back, Nick was looking at his plate. He'd been crying. "Have some more?" His father picked up the knife to cut the pie. "No," said Nick. "You better have another piece." "No, I don't want any." His father cleared off the table. "Where were they in the woods?" Nick asked. "Up back of the camp." Nick looked at his plate. His father said, "You better go to bed, Nick." "All right." Nick went into his room, undressed, and got into bed. He heard his father moving around in the living room. Nick lay in the bed with his face in the pillow. "My heart's broken," he thought. "If I feel this way, my heart must be broken." After a while, he heard his father blow out the lamp and go into his own room. He heard a wind come up in the trees outside and felt it come in cool through the screen. He lay for a long time with his face in the pillow, and after a while, he forgot to think about Prudence, and finally he went to sleep. When he awoke in the night, he heard the wind in the hemlock trees outside the cottage and the waves of the lake coming in on the shore, and he went back to sleep. In the morning, there was a big wind blowing, and the waves were running up high on the beach, and he was awake a long time before he remembered that his heart was broken. This concludes Classics You Slept Through's presentation of Men Without Women by Ernest Hemingway. Please join us next episode to discuss this section that we've just read.